Good evening. This is Robertson Janice coming to you again on the Open Question program for October the 29th, Tuesday, 2019. Today, we are gathered here as we are every week to take your questions, take your comments on topics of religion, the Bible, the church, tradition, the saints, the sacraments, anything that is of concern to you. In my role as host of this program, will endeavor to answer it as best I can from the knowledge I have from our three authorities in the Catholic Church: the Church, the tradition, and Scripture. And the Church being the magisterium, the official teachings of the Catholic Church, not opinions, not hearsay, not things that come up on the spur of the moment and things that people like to have the Catholic Church be, but the official teachings of the Catholic Church, which sometimes are far different than what is practiced and taught in the modern Catholic Church by some of our illustrious hierarchy. And now that I've opened the can of worms and let you know what kind of program this is, feel free to ask your questions. I do have a few advertisements, as always. I want again to push my major project right now, which is the exegetical commentary of the Douay Rheims New Testament from the original Greek. Okay, and that will come out in 2 volumes. Volume 1 is dealing with the Gospels and Acts, and that is about halfway done. And then volume 2 will be from Romans to Revelation, or the Apocalypse, as we like to say sometimes. So that one is about halfway done, maybe a little bit more than halfway done now. So actually, volume 2 will be the first volume that is put out, and I hope to have that done in about a year. And we'll hope to get an imprimatur and nihil obstat for this book, so that they can use it in the seminaries and universities all over the land, all over the world. Nothing like it on the market, never has been. There is none presently that I know of that goes deeply into the original Greek language of the New Testament and exegetes it from that perspective, giving you many more nuances, thoughts, understandings of the New Testament than you would ever get in the English translation. And last week I gave an example of the Greek word logizomai that's used in Romans 4. It's just one example out of thousands, literally thousands, in this book that I'm hoping to complete. So that is, again, not something for sale right now, but will be as soon as I can get it done. And I'm working feverishly every day to do it. And I do need your support. Okay, shameless self-promotion here. Not so shameless when it comes to asking people for support. I've had many people offer their donations so that I can basically sit here 10 hours a day and bang this thing out. Once it's out, we'll have it forever. And just a very good resource for conservative traditional Catholicism, supported by the inspired and inerrant language of God put in the New Testament. I don't know how else to say it. It's just one of those things that is, when it's done, it's just going to be fantastic. So we have a lot of books for sale also on robertsonjanice.org, .com, .net, It'll take you to the same place. We've put up some new books there in the last week or so. Lawrence, my confidant, has been kind enough to do that for me. And so take a look at it, robertsonjanice.org. And we have paperback books, we have hardback books, we have PDFs, we have CDs, we have DVDs, we have cassette tapes still, believe it or not. Cassette tapes. Someone ordered, what was it they ordered? A debate that we had back in the late 1990s that we have on cassette. So I'm assuming this person is of older age and still has an old cassette player, but we filled one of those orders, was it last week? And we get one of those every once in a while. And what else do we have? We have downloads, we have debates on downloads and on CDs. We have lectures that I've given at conferences on DVD and CD. So if you haven't visited our website, please do so. I think you'll be amazed at the materials we have. And believe it or not, there's a lot more materials we don't even have up on there on the website. And I'm hoping to get them up soon. And it takes a lot of work, but you know, like I said, I'm trying to spend most of my time trying to complete this Bible commentary. And that's where my energies lie right now. Okay, so enough of that. Last week, we had two questions that came up that I promised that I would answer after I did some research on them. And for some reason, the first one I had a hard time with because I just, for some reason, just couldn't remember. And that was the issue about, I think Ro had asked this. I don't know if she's here tonight, but she had asked regarding the passage I had in Not by Bread Alone, and she gave page 101. That was the wrong page number, Ro. It was actually on page 83, I think it was. Where was that? Yeah, around 83 or so. And what I'm covering there, and it's the same thing I covered in my commentary on the Apocalypse, and that is in chapter 5, which says that there's the Lamb, okay, and he is slain, but he's standing, okay. So now that's a little different than the passage in Apocalypse chapter 3 that says Christ is sitting at the right hand of God, because that's actually a literal occasion. He's sitting at the right hand of the Father, okay? But when we come to Apocalypse chapter 5, where this lamb is standing and his throat is slit, that's all symbolic language, okay? So that's what I was trying to remember last time, but wasn't able to because I was just off in La La Land somewhere. And that's the difference. So let me just explain a little bit about that. Apocalypse chapter 5 has a depiction of this lamb standing, okay? Now what that means basically is that it's symbolizing the fact that Christ is presenting his sacrifice to the Father. And this is an important thing because Christ is the lamb symbolizing Christ. He's standing, so that means he's serving, okay? How is he serving? By sacrificing himself, so to speak. So here's this lamb, its throat is slit, the blood is gushing out of it, and he's still standing. Okay, that's an interesting picture, because normally if you slit a lamb's throat, it's going to fall down. Okay, this lamb's throat is slit, the blood's pouring out, and he's still standing. He's standing before the throne. Okay, So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us exactly what happens at the Catholic Mass, okay? Because the sacrifice is represented, okay? And that sacrifice is taken up by the Holy Spirit. This is the epiclesis, to the Father, who's on the throne in heaven. And why is that? Well, because the sacrifice appeases the wrath of God against our sins. Okay? He sees the blood of his own Son and offered voluntarily to him, this innocent, sinless lamb sacrificed, and the Father can't help but be merciful and compassionate when he sees his own Son slain as a sacrifice to appease the Father's wrath. Okay? That's what's going on there. That's what happens every time we go to Mass. Okay? The sacrifice happens on the altar that we see. Of course, we don't see the sacrifice take place. We only believe that it's actually taking place when the bread turns into the body of Christ and the wine turns into the blood of Christ. Okay? We accept that by faith, but really what's happening is a representation of the death of Christ. Okay? And now that Christ is in heaven, he can offer the sacrifice to the Father every time that it's done on earth. Okay? And he can do it being alive, so to speak. Now that's a mystery in itself. Okay? But that's what happens. So that's why this lamb is pictured as standing before the throne, not kneeling, not falling down, not dead. He's alive, and the blood's gushing out. You also get a similar picture of this in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 23. And it's talking there about the difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And it says in the New Covenant, in the Old Covenant, the priest used to go in to the Holy of Holies, and he would offer the sacrifice on the Day of Atonement. Okay? This is one day per year. He goes into the altar to offer the sacrifice for all the sins of the people. Okay? And actually, there's a stipulation there. It says, all the sins done in ignorance of the people, not those that are done with deliberateness. Okay, that's an interesting little tack on there to the Day of Atonement. There's a big deal about that in the Old Testament. Okay, woe is you if you sin deliberately. Okay, you're excommunicated, you're out of the camp. Okay, that's what the Old Testament says. For those who sinned but did it ignorantly, well, there's a Day of Atonement for you. Okay, pretty strict. All right, so the high priest goes in there once a year to sacrifice for the sins of ignorance, and he comes out. All right, and by the way, while he's in there, we talk about how strict it is. They used to have a rope tied to his ankle, and he used to have tied to one ankle, and then he used to have a wristband. It's an ankle band with a bell on it on his other ankle. Okay, so when the priest is walking around doing his activity, they can tell he's there because they hear the bell ringing, because he's got to go from one side of the table to the other. He's got to get this vessel or that vessel and do his thing. And as he's walking around, the bell's ringing. Okay, so if perchance this high priest was in sin himself, okay, or was not worthy to offer the sacrifice, or he was a fake, or something happened where we didn't have, a legitimate sacrifice going on the Day of Atonement, God would strike him dead. And you couldn't go into the Holy of Holies to pull him out, because if you did, you would be struck dead. Okay, so if they didn't hear the bells ringing, they would start pulling on the rope that was tied to his other ankle so they could pull him out without having to go into the Holy of Holies. Hoping that his leg didn't get caught on the leg of the table or something, because be pulling and he wouldn't be coming, and then what do you do? Okay, so I guess the priest had to make it such that he would always be in a position where they could pull him out. All right, so at any rate, that's what went on there. But here's the problem. Okay, those sacrifices were temporary. They were given by God as a temporary reprieve, so to speak, for the sins of the people. And the validity of that was made because God was looking forward to the time Christ would die on the cross, okay, say 1,500 years later than when these high priest sacrifices started, okay? And so basically, God took a portion of the grace that would be provided by Christ, allowed it to rest on these sacrifices in the Old Testament, and that would forgive the people so that God's wrath would not come upon them. And they could have, somewhat of a clear conscience, so to speak, but not totally. And they were taught that, okay, that this is just a temporary forgiveness, which meant there was still some guilt that had to be dealt with. And if the priest was teaching the people right at that time, he would have told them that. Okay. And at any rate, so the priest does his sacrifice, he comes out, and then the next year comes the Day of Atonement, and he has to go back in to offer another sacrifice for that year of sins for the people. Again, the sins done in ignorance. Okay. And, he comes out, say he survives the sacrifice, he comes out. The next year he goes in, does the same thing. Okay. So Hebrews 9 is basically saying this is how it was in the Old Testament. So you had a temporary forgiveness, and you had the priest who had to go in and out every year to do the Day of Atonement. Christ is different, okay? He goes in once, and he stays there. Doesn't come out. He stays there. Because if he comes out, he's going to have to go back in again, okay? He goes in and he stays there, and he gives you a complete forgiveness. All guilt of sin is taken away, okay? All guilt. So, wow. What a difference, huh? But then he goes on in Hebrews chapter 9, and he talks about the sacrifices, and he uses the plural, which is really strange in Greek, because usually when we talk about Christ's sacrifice, we're talking about one sacrifice on the cross, and so is Hebrews. But in this one verse, it uses the plural, sacrifices, when it's talking about Christ offering the sacrifice in the Holy of Holies of the heavens, where the Father is, okay? So what does that mean? Well, it means that Christ on the cross went into the Holy of Holies, didn't come out, he stayed there, and what's he doing while he's there? He's showing the Father his sacrifice. And when does that happen? Every time there's a Mass on earth. So you might say that the sacrifice of Christ is continually being shown to the Father in heaven to appease the wrath of the Father against our sins on earth. Not only for our sins, but the sins of the world, basically. Because think about it. If there was nothing to appease the wrath of God to his satisfaction, what would happen to the world? It would be burned up like a crisp in a second. Okay? The only thing that allows this world to go on day after day, no matter what you see on the news, okay, about how bad it is out there, the reason it goes on to the next day, so you can turn on the TV and see even more sin, is because the sacrifice of the cross is being offered to the Father in heaven, who is appeased, his wrath is appeased, so that day he's not going to destroy the earth. Okay? And the next day, the sacrifices are brought before him again, and that day he's not going to destroy the earth. Okay? That's what the sacrifice of Christ gives us, not only for Christians, but for the rest of the world. That their judgment doesn't come any sooner than it already is planned for. Okay? So that's one thing he does. And so that's why the Hebrew writer uses this word sacrifices, because he's getting the idea across that this presentation of the sacrifice of Calvary is being continually presented to the Father in heaven, you see. So that's why this lamb in Apocalypse 5 is a lamb standing, because that means it's active, not dead, not sitting down, resting. He's active, and the blood is gushing from his throat because his throat has been slit. Okay, another picture of the fact that the Father on the throne is continually seeing this blood gushing. Okay, and that's what appeases his wrath, so that we can live another day. So this is all serious business. Okay, the metaphors are there to bring out, to make a graphic presentation of what's occurring with this sacrifice. What does it mean? How is it affecting everything? And you get a great picture of it when you read Apocalypse 5. Okay, so that's the answer to Rose's question. Sorry, I went on 20 minutes on that one, but you know how it is. Then we had a question from, I forget who it was. He asked about Ignatius, St. Ignatius of Antioch, and what was the nature of it? Oh, okay. So he asked, when Ignatius uses the word Catholic in a passage, what is he referring to? Because some Protestants say, oh, well, that's not the real, that's not the Catholic Church that you belong to. That's just, a general reference to the church. So I looked it up, and that passage comes from the epistle to the Smyrnaeans, and you can find that in the Ante-Nicene Fathers by Schaff, and that would be chapter 8, verses section 1, 89 to 90. And here's what he says. Notice, I'm not going to read the whole paragraph. Well, maybe I should. It says, see that you follow the bishop, even as Jesus Christ does the Father, and the presbytery, as you would the apostles. Now, they use the word presbytery here. Now, Schaff was a Protestant, okay? So he's going to use, the Greek word is presbyteros, and it would be the same in the Latin. It's almost exactly the same, presbyteros. And so he's going to translate that as presbytery. It's okay, but what we really mean here, if you want, because presbytery is derived from priest, okay, in English. It used to be prost, then it became priest, but it's still, the origin of it is this Greek word presbyteros, okay? So you could basically say here, and the priests, as you would the apostles, okay? And reverence the deacons as being the institution of God. Let no man do anything connected with the church without the bishop. Okay, so what do we have here? We have the Catholic Church as it stands today. This is back in the 1st century, okay? That Ignatius is probably writing this. And or maybe early 2nd century, all right, possibly. But he mentions bishops, the priests, the deacons, and then he says, let them be deemed a proper Eucharist. Okay, so he's already got knowledge of the Eucharist, and he's calling it the Eucharist, Eucharisto, which is administered either by the bishop, all right, or by one to whom he has entrusted it, which would be the priest. Whenever the bishop shall appear, there let the multitude of people also be, even as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. So that's his mention of the Catholic Church. Okay. But what context do we have here? All right. And he says Catholic Church, and this is in translated by a Protestant. All right. So he must have seen Catholica and Ecclesia in the same sentence for him to translate it as Catholic Church. Okay. So it's church with an adjective before it, and the adjective is Catholic. That's how Ignatius is using it. So, and then he goes on the next sentence, it is not lawful without the bishop either to baptize or to celebrate a love feast. Now, the love feast, by the way, was, and Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the love feast was a meal that the members of the church had before they had the Eucharist. Okay, actually before they had the Eucharist, not after. Okay. And, actually this caused some problems in the church because the Corinthians weren't distinguishing, eating bread at their love feast as opposed to taking the Eucharist that was, confected to be the body of Christ. Big problem in Corinth. But that was the love feast. So he's saying the bishop has to baptize, or at least he has to authorize it, and or celebrating a love feast. But whoever he shall approve of, that is also pleasing to God, so that everything that is done may be secure and valid. Okay, and he goes on and on and on, talking about all the things that happen in the church. So that's why I said I needed to look at the context again, and this context is Catholic to the core. Okay, Catholic to the core, and you can verify it by reading the rest of what Ignatius said. If you have who's that other guy? Jurgens. If you have Jurgens's 3-volume series, just go look up Ignatius in there and read all his letters, and you'll see that it's all Catholic. There's no other, come on, there's no other religion at that time. There's no other Christian religion. It's all Catholic. The bishops are already appointed. The Bishop of Rome is already appointed, way back in the mid-1st century. Peter was in Rome around what? At least in the 60s, okay? If not in the 50s. He spent some time in Antioch, then he came to Rome, became the Bishop of Rome. And, so right from the get-go, I mean, it's as clear as day, all right? You have to be blind not to see it, that the church was one holy Catholic church, okay? There was nothing else. There was no other game in town. The only other games in town were the heretics, the Monsinists or the Apollinarians, or whoever it was, the Gnostics. That was the other game in town, of course, but they were all heretics, and the church deemed them heretics to protect the church. So there we have it. Okay, so let's get to our question board here, see what we got tonight. Ben says, greetings, Robert. Romans chapter 1 describes sodomites and lesbians. Verse 32 says, They who do such things are worthy of death. And not only they that do them, but they also that consent to them that do them. Is it fair to conclude that the state should have on the books the death penalty for sodomites and lesbians, as well as for straight people who support them, like certain politicians do? Thank you. Well, of course. I mean, yes, they should. You know, we used to do that in certain societies back in Europe. Not here. But of course, they may have done it here. I need to look at American history. But, you know, homosexuals, it wasn't until the turn of the century that they started to be accepted here in the United States. And even then, it was a tough road for them. Okay. Most of them were still in the closet by the 1940s and 50s. So this whole idea of accepting homosexuals, transgenders, whatever, is a new thing. Totally new. You know, there might have been some societies that tolerated homosexuals to a point, as long as they didn't make a fuss and they did it in their privacy, unless they were caught, nobody did anything about it. But of course, they would have had a name around town, you know, that this guy was a little fruity, and, you know, that would mean if they ever got caught in the act, they would have been prosecuted and they could have been executed. Okay. This is nothing new in society. I mean, as a matter of fact, you know, when we studied a few sessions ago on this program, I was talking about Andrew Toynbee's book about the civilizations. And he was, what does he have? 19 volumes to that? Examine all the civilizations, and what he found in each of them is the decline of the nation began when they started to institutionalize homosexuality, make it legitimate, giving excuses for it. Okay. And gee, where are we right now? Yep, we're right in this in the target area. The very thing that Andrew Toynbee, or Arnold, not Andrew, Arnold Toynbee had predicted. Okay, that's where we are. Okay, back in the Old Testament, you know, if you were caught lying with another man, if you were a man, you'd be stoned to death. No questions asked. You had to have the witnesses. Okay, because that's one thing Jewish law did not allow, is for someone to be executed just based on hearsay. And that protects a society, because hearsay can be just as bad or even worse than the actual crime itself. Because then what happens is you may convict innocent people of crimes, of capital crimes, who will get a capital punishment. Okay? But it's clear in the Old Testament. You know, very clear. Just like adultery. You know, if you were caught in adultery with 2 or 3 witnesses who caught you in the adultery, you would be stoned to death. Okay? You know, those rules were very strict back then. I mean, and one of them says, if the woman cried out, you know, rape, rape, or something like that, where it could be known that she was not offering her consent, she would escape death. Okay, but that had to be witnessed also. And you know, so you know, a lot of rules like that. And the reason why is because God always said this at the end of a command like this. He always said, because the camp must be kept clean. The camp must be kept clean. Remember, I talked a few programs ago about the divorce law, you know, where you have this strange phrase there, irvat dabar. You know, you could divorce your wife for irvat dabar. And the only other place that's used is in the previous chapter, Deuteronomy 23, verse 14. And an irvat dabar there is defecation. So basically God is saying, I don't want to see any irvat dabars in the camp. I want you to go outside the camp, dig a hole, do your duty, cover it up, come back into the camp. Why? To keep the camp clean. Because the Lord your God walks through the camp. Oof. Talk about a close God. The Lord your God walks through the camp. So I want it spick and span if I'm going to come and walk through the camp. All right. So there's a lesson for cleanliness, huh? There you go. God walks through your room. God walks through your kitchen. God walks through your living room. So you better keep it neat. I'll use that one on my wife and my kids, actually, and on myself. Anyway, so you see how strict the laws were, okay? So, you know, and what we do in the New Testament, this is an important point. Why is the Old Testament so big? Well, because it's trying to show you the life of the people as they lived it out. Okay, the New Testament's not quite like that. The New Testament, except for the book of Acts, when the gospel is being preached and it follows Peter and Paul as they go through all the cities, in a sense, that's living out the gospel, but that's not like dealing with, you know, what happened in Lydia's house or what happened in Cornelius's house, you know, all that kind of stuff. We don't get that kind of picture in the New Testament. We basically get doctrine. We get teachings about morality. We get teachings about how to relate to our bosses, our wives, our husbands, the children, basic things like that. But there's no, you know, sitcom, so to speak, of New Testament life in the New Testament. It's just not there. You might get some of the Gospels, but that's still on the Old Testament side of the cross until Jesus is raised from the dead. So in the Old Testament, man, talk about sitcoms. Yeah, every page there's another sitcom, so to speak. And you know, it's interesting, like the sitcoms today deal with sin. Well, so did the sitcoms in Old Testament narratives. Almost all of them are about sin, how somebody fell into sin and what was done and how to avoid it and all this. And you got right down to the nitty-gritty of how these people lived in the Old Testament, right into their very hearts, what they were deciding in their consciousness and their hearts. Like when it talks about David, you know, David's confronted with all these things. What's he going to do? What's he going to do? And David actually spills his guts out to his friend Jonathan and says, you know, what should I do? What should I do? And they figure it out right there. So, you know, boy, these are dramatic narratives about the lives of these people. Okay. So it's big because it does that. I mean, you got to cover all the intricacies of the lives of these people. So you come out with a book that takes up what, 8/10 of the Bible, you know? All right. But in there, there's a lot of moral laws, there's a lot of civil laws, a lot of ceremonial laws, okay? But when the New Testament comes, as we've said, and as is the truth, as the church has taught, as Scripture has taught, as tradition has taught, the Old Testament is revoked. It's revoked. What does that mean? Well, it has no legal authority on us now, any longer. So any law that you read in the Old Testament has no effect on you now. Now, someone will say, well, you know, what about the 10 Commandments? You know, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, all those, okay? Don't they apply to me? Well, yes, but not because they're in the Old Testament, you see. They were adopted by the New Testament, New Covenant in Jesus Christ. And if they weren't, then we would not be under obligation to obey, do not steal, do not commit adultery, okay? But the New Testament covenant said, no, they're good laws. So we're going to take those laws, because they're divine laws. We're going to take them and we're going to put them into the new covenant. So now you're under the jurisdiction of the new covenant, and that's why you obey those laws. And Paul points them out in Romans chapter 13. He goes through the 10 Commandments, except the fourth one. There's a reason for that, okay? So that's where that's the similarity between the Old and New Testaments. But there are some laws, most of them, that the new covenant did not transpire over to the take from the old covenant and put it in the new covenant. Okay, and there's a reason for that too. All right, but those moral laws, well, they were very important to take over, and so they did. So one of those laws, of course, dealt with homosexuals, dealt with adultery, capital crimes like killing someone. Okay, why do nations in the modern times, or medieval times for that matter, execute people for killing someone else? Because it was in the Old Testament. And those Old Testament laws, even though the Old Testament was revoked, the New Covenant, by the authority of the church, can take those laws and implement them under the authority or jurisdiction of the New Covenant, you see. So now in the medieval times, what we had with the Catholic Church was we had the church at large was the religious power, and then we had secular power alongside of that. We had kings of nations, okay, but the church was so powerful at that time that the church checked the power of the king, and the king could check the power of the church, so to speak. So they had this sort of symbiotic relationship, and they both needed each other because the church didn't have armies. The king had the armies, but the king had to obey and use his armies correctly, morally. And where did that information come from? It came from the church. Okay, so the secular and the religious were in constant communication with each other and kept each other in check, so to speak, because you can have some wicked clerics too. You could have heretics, you could have wayward sinners that lived at the Vatican, and let's say you wanted to remove them and they wouldn't go. Well, the Pope would call up the king and say, hey, I got a job for you. Come and get Mr. Smith out of the Vatican, or, take so-and-so, the homosexual, out of the Vatican, and apply the civil laws to them. And mostly those civil laws were execution, okay, for capital crimes. And homosexuality was a capital crime. Same thing would happen for murder or rape, capital crime. The bishop would call up the secular forces, say, hey, do your thing. Okay. So there you have it. Yes, the answer to the question is yes. It's always been that way. And why isn't it that way today? Well, just like Toynbee said, we're on the downstretch. We're not on the up. We're going down. You can see the signs everywhere. Okay. I mean, they're talking about having a socialist government. The millennials, they're talking about having a socialist government. These people are clueless. Now, we might say, well, it might not be any fault of their own because they haven't lived through all the turmoil. Well, that's true. And this is what happens to the next generation. If they haven't experienced it, they don't really have deep-gutted emotions about it. And they just can't think it out for themselves. They think that the best thing to do is strive for this utopian society, and that somehow socialism or communism is going to distribute the wealth so that everybody's happy. That's delusional, okay? Because it just doesn't happen. It's a great ideal, but in all practicality, it never happens, okay? Because once the money starts to flow, the greed of mankind, whether you're poor, rich, or indifferent, is going to want to grab as much as you can. And if you grab as much as you can, what's that going to do for the guy next to you? Well, he's not going to have as much. And that's what invariably happens in any kind of society like that. Okay? They haven't lived through that, so they are just not aware of the downside of socialism or communism. It all sounds good on paper, but not in real life. Okay, so we're going down, and it's just a matter of time. Okay, just a matter of time. And in our day, we had, let's say, in the 1700s, 1800s, we had popes preaching of the social kingship of Christ. Okay, where's that gone? Okay, Catholics hardly know about the social kingship of Christ, much less are they motivated to try to make it part of society. I understand, it's almost an impossible task today. We can wonder about the glory days of yesteryear, so to speak, when the Catholic Church had so much power over the world that no one would cross the Pope, but that all changed. That all changed. It ain't the same as it was before. This is what was bad, first of all, about the schism we had in 1054 with the Eastern Orthodox, but their numbers aren't that great. So, we try to appease them, in 1400s, and we had a little peace with them. We thought they were going to come back, and they never came back, and they just got harder in their stance as time went on after that. And so that was over, so we had a split. And, if you're going to have one split, you can have two splits. You have two, you can have three. So, by the time Luther and Calvin come along, Zwingli and Bucer and all these people, here's the supreme test against the Catholic Church's authority. And, it's like John says in the Apocalypse, he took 1/3 of the stars away, which refers to the angels. That's basically what Protestantism did. He took 1/3 of the Catholic Church away, and she's left with 2/3, and went to, wage war against the church. It's almost symbolic. I'm not saying that that's how you interpret Apocalypse 12. I'm just saying history repeats itself, so to speak. Okay, so you had no social kingship of Christ, or at least it was a diluted social kingship of Christ in the 1500s already. Okay, so basically we had a period of, let's say, from the major councils in the 4th century to the 1500s, the medieval age. You had basically 1,000 years or so, give or take 100 or 200. Okay, it wasn't exactly 1,000, but give or take. We're talking about after the persecutions of Rome and the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD to, let's say, 1500. You had, the Catholic Church was in rule, and the kings and the popes were working together, under the whole under Charlemagne, for example. It was glorious. Too bad they couldn't be living today. In the 800s, under Charlemagne, it was just a very interesting arrangement between king and pope. Okay, but there's the social kingship of Christ. Okay, and this is why the Galileo issue is so important. Think about it. Okay, first you had the Protestants come along, and let's say they take 1/3 of the church away and diminishes her social kingship. And then you have Galileo attacking the church, and Newton, and all in the science level. Okay, so here the church is tested not in the rulership realm, but she's challenged in the intellectual realm. Okay, because who's going to interpret the stars for us? Okay, well, we have these fancy instruments here. What do you have? You have the Bible? Okay, so you can see what's going to happen. So this is the second attack on the church's social kingship, because the intellectual authority of the church is challenged. All right. Now the church survives Why? Because the Pope, understanding the social kingship of Christ, says, we're even the rulers over the heavens, not just the earth, the heavens also. Okay, the heavens and the earth is where our rule extends to the rim of the universe, if you want to put it that way. Okay, not just here on the horizon, between the horizons of the earth. It extends to the universe. And so we declare that the earth does not move and the universe moves around it. That's big power. That's big power. Okay? So the church basically let the world know that you can't escape. There's no place for you to hide. You can't go to Mars or Jupiter, Alpha Centauri. You can't create multiverses because we own it all. We rule over all of it. Okay? And so the secular forces, by this time now, the secular forces were feeling their oats, as horses do. They were feeling their oats. And when the scientists came along, the new priesthood, you see, and they started saying things, well, look, it's not angels that push planets, it's F equals ma. Now, I'm not saying I believe angels push planets, okay? Don't anybody quote me on that. I'm just showing you the difference in thinking, okay? Nobody knew what gravity was, you know? They all took it for granted. You know, throw an apple up, it's going to come down. It's just something that happened. But then you got this guy Newton come along and say, well, the reason it came down was because F equals ma. Okay? You could put it into an equation. That was powerful. You could put it into an equation, a mathematical equation. And everybody already knew that 2 + 2 = 4. And that's basically what Newton was saying. Look, 2 + 2 = 4. You can't argue with that, can you? Okay? So, yeah, and we discovered that. We secular scientists, or we anti-Catholic scientists, let's put it that way. And so there was another hit against the church. And by the time of Newton, then you had he was right, just stone's throw from the Enlightenment. He was in the High Renaissance, and just a stone's throw from the Enlightenment. And basically, Newton's equations were like a hydrogen bomb mushroom cloud that just enveloped the whole society. Okay, and now science became the cudgel to beat up the church. And by the time of Pope Pius VII, when someone, so for 200 years, the church had ruled the skies. He ruled the universe because of the Galileo decree against Copernicanism. Then in the 1800s, early 1800s, Pope Pius VII comes along, very weak pope, and he is lied to by his commissioner of the Holy Office, Maurizio Olivieri, and Olivieri makes up excuses for why the church had condemned Galileo, and they were total lies. But he nonetheless convinced Pius VII that he should give an imprimatur to this canon. His name was Canon Satelli, who wrote a book on heliocentrism. And right from there, things started to change because Pius granted the imprimatur because he was lied to. And then, Olivieri's cohort was Cardinal Capillari, who became Gregory XVI in 1831 and took Galileo's name off the index in 1835. See, but he and Olivieri had, fixed the book, so to speak. Okay, and here's another blow to the church, and it was right after Gregory the 16th died. okay, that we see all the liberal onslaught in the church occurring in the 1800s, and Pius IX was caught up in that, and he was a full flaming liberal before he became Pope. And he was going to change the church even more, except that office changed him. And he became a conservative, thank God. And so did Leo the 13th after him. But in the secular forces, the onslaught was unbelievable. Unbelievable how they were trying to undermine the church. Okay, because, hey, they said, if you're going to take Galileo off the index, everything's open for game now. Everything's open. Okay, that's when it all began. And we've just been sliding downhill ever since. So that's why this Galileo issue is so important, and which I don't mind talking about, as you can see. All right, so let me go on to the next question. What is something good that came out of Vatican II? Well, there's a lot of good that came out of Vatican II, Jordan. 95% of the documents of Vatican II are right on, telling us how the gospel was put together, how it saved souls. There's 16 documents in Vatican II. We concentrate on 4 of them because there's some ambiguities in those doctrines that create problems. Okay, but then we forget about the other 12 documents. Read those documents. Talk about a poetic way of whoever wrote those documents. I'd like to meet him someday, because he has a style of prose there that's just amazing. Okay, and you can learn a lot about the church from those documents. Even the 4 documents that we have problems with, there's some good things in there too. Okay, it's just those 4 documents that we're trying to be. And what they did, according to Cardinal Casper, is, the conservatives would write one paragraph and the liberals would write the next paragraph, because they couldn't agree. And so they put both of them in there. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. Okay, and those just happen to be some of the important issues that we have to deal with today. All right, so yeah, there's Vatican II, by and large, and when I say large, I'm talking about 95% of it. There's no problems with it at all. All right, some of the best treatises on theology in the Catholic Church that I've ever read. Okay, so there you go. You know the rest of the story, though, I think. Jordan says, next time I get into an argument with another Catholic, where is the best place I can go to find the true teachings of the church? I think you mean I thought the catechism would do, but since Vatican II, I don't think that is the case. Well, yeah, you have a point there. The best place to go is to get Denzinger's Sources of Catholic Dogma, translated by Roy DeFari. Okay, in there you will find all the dogmatic statements of the church. Okay, that's where you want to start. That's an invaluable book. Never leave home without it, so to speak. Okay, because it crystallizes all Catholic doctrine for you. Okay, and you can see how the church was maturing in her understanding of the faith, because with each century that went by, you have different nuances of the faith and the sacraments, the doctrines, all being crystallized by the church. Okay, so that's where you would want to go. The Tridentine Catechism, 1566, is another very good source that you can go to. As a matter of fact, in the preface of that catechism, it says this catechism was made for doctrine. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty good. Then the Catholic Catechism of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, published in 1992, 94, 97. 3 editions already, because they had problems in the first one. Then they had to clean up. I think, who was it? The theologian from France. What's his name? I don't know why I can't think of him. Can't think of him. Anyway, he picked out 12 errors in that catechism. And so they had to clean it up and make the new edition, and then finally another edition in '97. But they're still not out of there. There's still some, it's like the whole thing about, the Muslims believe in one God. Tough question to answer. That could be yes or no, depending on what your context is. Okay. It's like that question, have you stopped beating your wife? No matter what answer you give, you're going to give the wrong answer. So you have to treat that gingerly and with a lot of context before you even venture into those deep waters that Vatican II got itself into. Not Vatican II, the Catechism got itself into. So, and we have problems with homosexuality in that catechism. A little weak, still better than, what Francis is teaching, but, still a little weak. It should have been a lot stronger. And there's a few other places. Still can't remember that guy's name. Anyway, so I hope I answered that question for you. Okay, Suzanne says, do you have children's books on geocentrism or any other miracle that scientists are scratching their heads about? I hope to become a grandmother one day. Yes, Suzanne, I do. Okay, I have the book. You didn't see this yet? All right, well, it gives me a chance for more advertisement. Geocentrism for dumbskis like you, Suzanne, and smart kids. Just kidding. Yeah, okay, and it says here, right here, ages 10 and up. All right, now I haven't made anything for kids 10 and younger yet. That's a challenge. I thought it would be a challenge to write like Galileo was wrong. Was that 2,200 pages? Put all the scientific evidence in. I find it harder to write for kids, 10 and younger than I do the adult books, because, man, trying to explain a somewhat complex topic in simple language is not an easy task. I will try to do that someday. I hope to accomplish that. But for now, this is what we have, okay? It's got wide font in it, words are big, and a lot of pictures. So, and I even have little emojis in there, keep the kids laughing, okay? So, here's another emoji, okay? So whenever these scientists say something that's like totally harebrained, there you see it. You see the emoji. What? What did he just say? So there you have it, okay? Now, since it's color pictures all throughout, okay, all color pictures, beautiful pictures. This is $29.95, okay? So, but well worth it. It also comes in hardback, but that's $64.95. This one, this one was expensive because of all the color pictures, but there's nothing like it out there. Nobody's ever written a book like this, okay? First one in the world. I can tell you that honestly. All right. So that's for your kids. They'll love you for it. So go to my website, robertsonjanice.org, and make your purchase. Okay. Adam says, greetings, Robertson Janice. Trent Horn believes there can be a Christian feminism. Tim Gordon disagrees and is writing a book, No Christian Feminism. Who do you agree with? Tim Gordon. Trent, I've heard some other things Trent Horn has taught, and I'm a little leery of those as well. I'm not going to get into that right now, but this whole movement, feminism, let me tell you a little story about Israel. Isaiah, in the midst of Israel's apostasy, when they're just about to go into captivity, he says in Isaiah 3, verse 12, children are their oppressors and women rule over them. Okay? This is what happens to a society when it starts to go downhill. Women rule over them. What was the problem with Adam and Eve? Same thing. Okay? That's why the devil came to Eve first. Eve took the bait and began to rule, and basically persuaded her husband to eat the fruit. You know, not that Adam was some kind of, hero here, of course, but he was deceived by the woman. Now, this passage in Genesis chapter 3 is covered by Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 to 15. And in the section there, he says, let the woman be silent and submissive to the man. Okay? Now, the word silent there is not talking just about vocal silence. It's talking about composure, disposition. Okay? Let her disposition be silent. One of, humility, meekness, that sort of thing. Okay? And then he says, and why is this the case? At first he says, the man is in authority, not the woman. Okay? Same thing in the home. Okay? Paul's talking about the church, same thing in the home. In Ephesians 5, it says the woman is to be submissive to the husband. The wife is submissive to the husband, just like the church is to Christ. And all this hullabaloo you hear about Ephesians 5:21, where it says, where some people, Catholics, have taught that there's mutual submission between husband and wife. No. That applies to the previous verses. We can tell this contextually and grammatically when we look at the Greek. Okay? And even if someone were to argue, that there's some kind of mutual submission, well, on the practical level, there always is between husband and wife. Okay? When my wife tells me to take out the garbage, what am I going to say to her? Hey, I'm in authority here. You can't tell me what to do. Yeah. We'll see how long that marriage lasts. Okay? No, I'm going to say, yes, honey, thank you very much for reminding me. I'll be right up as soon as I write this next paragraph. Actually, I get my son to take out the garbage, so, I don't have to worry about it. But what's the point? My wife asked me to take out the garbage. I'll take out the garbage. Okay? I'm not going to raise, I'm going to pick my battles very judiciously. And that's not what I'm going to fight over. Okay? Besides, I enjoy taking out the trash for my wife. I love my wife, so I want to help her. Okay? So in that sense, yeah, there's mutual submission. Okay? I don't have to go around holding an iron peg or a battle weapon, ruling my roost over the house, so to speak. No, that's the furthest thing Paul means by authority. Okay. But by the same token, my wife respects my authority. She constantly will come to me. Okay, here's our options, Bob. Option A, option B, option C. Which one shall we do? What do you think? No, I'll either say, well, there's option D also. You forgot about that one. Or I'll say A is the best one. But she comes to me because I'm the authority of the household. She's respecting that I'm the authority and she's submissive to that authority. Why? Hey, that's the best way to get along. Could you imagine if two of you were going to clash about that? Well, I think A and you think B. Well, we'll never get anything done. Okay? So there's a reason for the order of hierarchy. All right? So then back to 1 Timothy, Paul says, not only is the man going to have the authority over the woman, I'm going to tell you why. And he gives two reasons. The first reason is Adam was first formed and then Eve. That's in verse 13 of chapter 2. Now, a lot of people forget that, because you'll hear a lot of Catholics today saying, well, the reason that women are to be submissive to the man is because Eve sinned first and then made Adam sin. As if, and what you connote from that is that authority is the default position that we have to go into because of sin. No. Okay. No. That sin just reinforced the authority Adam already had over Eve, which he didn't exercise in the Garden of Eden. Because Paul's argument is Adam was first created, and that creation, being first in the creation order, gave him the authority, you see. So Eve was already in submission to Adam before the devil ever met them, because that's the way God ordained it from the beginning, just like he ordained male and female. That's why Jesus was talking to the Pharisees. He says, from the beginning it was not so. What was so? That they would be male and female, and they would stick together as one flesh. Okay, what else was so? That the husband was in charge. The husband was in authority. The woman was submissive. Why? Because Adam was first formed. Okay, that's the reason St. Paul gives. And he's inspired by the Holy Spirit to write that. And of course, you hear some talk today, well, you know, that was all in Paul's culture. We don't have to pay attention to that. You know, Paul deals with that very objection in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, when he says to the woman, be silent in the church. Now, that word silent, okay, that's the Greek word sigao, which means silent vocally. Be silent in the church. No talking. If you need to talk, ask your husband at home. That's what he says. As in all the churches, in verse 33. Okay? Let the woman be in submission to the man, as in all the churches that I have taught. Okay, so there's your first thing. It's all the churches that believe this. And then he says, as also saith the law. Wow. So here's his second witness. The law, back in the Old Testament, said the same thing. Paul's taking it up again in the New Covenant. So that's my moral basis. That's my precedent, the law, that tells women to assume this position. Okay? And then he brings the third. He says, as the Lord has commanded. Okay? So you have three witnesses now. And then he says, if any of you think you know better, if you think you know better than me, sorry for you, chum. Okay? Because I'm God's apostle. I'm laying down what God told me, basically, to tell you. Okay? So that whole idea about, you know, women being in submission because it's just a cultural idea of Paul's, well, Paul shoots that to death in 1 Corinthians 14. Okay? And back to 1 Timothy, in verse 15, Paul says, and the women can be saved by childbearing. Well, how do you childbear? Well, that doesn't happen when you're out in the workaday world competing with men, trying to be like men, cutting your hair short like men, and looking like men, acting like men. Yeah, you're not going to be childbearing. Okay? The childbearer is a woman who's submissive to her husband, stays in home while he goes out and works, and raises children, which is her primary duty. And that, Paul says, will lead to her salvation. Okay, so because what kind of women do you find who are the childbearers? Yeah, you find meek, humble women who love the Lord and want to raise children for his kingdom. No wonder he says it leads to salvation. Okay, and what kind of women do you find out in the workforce today? These secular women that go out there? Oh yeah, baby. You know, they act like men, they look like men, they want to be men, they want to knock men down, they want to compete with men, and the whole society's being turned upside down. The old saying, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. Yeah, well, there ain't nobody rocking the cradle now except an Annie, and she could care less. She's only doing what she gets paid to do. Now, she may like the children when she works for her. I'm not saying that that can't happen, but she's not the mother. Okay, there's nobody that's going to care for her children like the mother. All right. So this whole idea of feminism, this is what we're talking about. Feminism, where, you know, you can go out in the world and accomplish the same feats that men do, and if you're a Christian woman, you know, you feel a little guilt for doing that, so you want to stay home as well, but you can't do that. You know, you're going to drive yourself and your husband crazy when you try to split your world into two different worlds, and you're not going to be successful at either one of them because your interests are divided. If you would stay home, take care of your children, and as the saying goes, rock that cradle right so that you raise upstanding citizens, that's what God's looking for. Okay? He's not looking for you to put all your trophies on the wall and all your plaques of where you've been and, you know, look at me, how great I am. I can compete with men and do a great job, you know, blah, blah, blah. Okay? If you want to do that, then don't get married. Okay? And God bless you. All right? But that's not Christianity. All right? But that's what feminism is. All right? So there is no Christian feminism. This is a worldly idea that has got itself into the church, just like the Judaizers used to try to get into the infant church in St. Paul's day and disrupt it, you know, saying, you know, Christ isn't enough for you. You need this, you need that, you need the other thing to grow in your Christian life. That's what the feminists are doing with women today. Staying at home with your children is not enough. You know, you need to expand your horizons. Go here, go there. You know, man, you know what? I want to tell you something. I've been working in the workaday world for what, 50 years or more? And I'll tell you something, it's rough out there. It's a dog-eat-dog world. And I feel sorry for the women that have to go out there and compete in that dog-eat-dog world. Especially when the man senses that you're trying to push him out of the way. Okay? You better be prepared for some backlash. Okay? That's just the way the world is. Men do that to men in the dog-eat-dog world. Okay? You think he's not going to do that to you, women? Well, yeah. You're threatening his livelihood. He has to support his children. Okay? So this is no place for a woman to be. Now, granted, if they have to be there, if they're not married or they're older and they've already raised their children, or, you know, there's all kinds of reasons why women can go out into the society, and how can we do without them? Okay? But we're not talking about that. We're talking about young women, 20, 30 years old, perhaps 40, who have to make their mark in the world. Instead of having children, they have to make their mark in the world. Like, you know, they're Attila the Hun or something, or, you know, whatever it is, whatever figure they're adulating, as if, you know, they can go out there and conquer, so to speak. There's nothing to conquer. And it's a hard job to begin with. Okay? So, yeah, I'm on Tim Gordon's side. Thank God Tim Gordon is writing that book. I'll have to get myself a copy of it. I'm sure he's done a good job. I've seen him teach about other things, and the man is a great intellect. Okay, and I appreciate the work that he does. So, amen to that. Dr. Robert, what is your opinion about Mama? I call it Pokemama. It's the only way I can remember it. Pokemama. G1, is that your name? I'm not sure what that means. Is that a pseudonym? Pokemama, there's no place for Pokemama in the Catholic Church. Okay, this is all these ecological, climate change people. They're nuts. Okay, they're crazy. The world is not going to end in 12 years. Okay, contrary to what AOC tells us, the climate is not changing. If it is, it's going through the cycles that it always goes through. God's in control. Okay, most of these people are godless. That's why they're so worried about the earth. They think the earth is at the mercy of the stars or something. It's not. So, whatever their concept of God, who knows what that is? So I think they worship the earth, basically, these people. And that's why they're so infatuated with Pokemama and fertility. It's like the fertility goddesses of the Greek mystery cults. They were all so excited about fertility and all this, and that became the god that they worshipped. As Paul says, they worship the creation and forget about the creator. It's the same thing over and over again. We see, in the book of Isaiah or Sirach, Wisdom, you read about the Israelites when the prophet says they get a piece of wood and they carve the wood. They spend hours and hours carving the wood to make it look like a figurine, and they worship it. Then they take the other part of the wood that they